Imagine a store that promised unbeatable deals, a place that drew customers from all over with prices that seemed too good to be true. This store wasn't just about discounts, it was the empire of a man whose ambition and greed knew no limits. This is the story of Eddie Antar, known to the world as Crazy Eddie, and how his empire rose to greatness only to come crashing down in one of the largest retail frauds of all time. Welcome to the Insight Vault. If you're fascinated by stories of ambition, greed, and deception, then be sure to subscribe. Stick with us as we dive into the incredible story of Crazy Eddie, an empire that seemed unstoppable until the truth came out. Our story begins in Brooklyn, New York, in the 1940s. Eddie Antar was born into a family of Syrian Jewish immigrants. His parents had come to America in search of a better life, and they taught their children the importance of hard work and determination. Growing up, Eddie saw his family struggle. Money was tight, and he quickly learned the value of a dollar. But young Eddie also had a mischievous side. Even as a boy, he was clever, finding ways to make money on the streets of Brooklyn. His quick wit and ambition set him apart, and he dreamed of building a life far from the struggles he saw around him. Though he wasn't interested in school, Eddie had a natural knack for business. In his late teens, he started working in retail, and he realized something important. The secret to success wasn't just in selling products. It was in selling a story that would make people believe in his business, and he was going to use this insight to build an empire. In 1969, Eddie opened his first electronics store in Brooklyn, calling it Crazy Eddie. He knew that in the competitive world of retail, he had to stand out. And stand out he did, with a strategy that was nothing short of insane. Eddie advertised heavily. His commercials featured loud, over-the-top announcers yelling, "Crazy Eddie's prices are insane." These ads were wild and unforgettable. People loved them, and soon, everyone in New York knew about Crazy Eddie. It was a brand with personality, and Eddie made sure customers felt they were getting the best deal possible. With his unique brand and attention-grabbing marketing, Crazy Eddie quickly became a household name. The stores were busy, customers were happy, and Eddie was seeing profits like never before. But this was just the beginning of a much larger plan, a plan that would take Crazy Eddie to the top of the retail world and bring it crashing down. As business boomed, Eddie discovered another way to increase profits: by skimming. In the beginning, it was just small amounts. Eddie would take cash from the register and underreport sales, essentially dodging taxes. This method brought in extra money that didn't appear on the books. But skimming was just the start. Eddie's family became involved too, helping him keep the scheme hidden. They even had a family code for it. Soon, skimming became a regular practice, and the Antar family was growing richer by the day. But for Eddie, this wasn't enough. He wanted to expand, and he knew he'd need to take Crazy Eddie public to achieve that dream. Skimming alone wouldn't support a public company, so Eddie and his family started thinking bigger. They began creating fraudulent inventory records, inflating sales, and inventing profits to make the business look more successful than it was. This was just the start of a massive deception that would soon go out of control. By the late 1970s, Crazy Eddie was one of the most successful electronics retailers in New York. With stores popping up all over the East Coast, Eddie had created a powerful brand that dominated the market. People flocked to his stores for deals, and it seemed like nothing could slow him down. The secret to Crazy Eddie's success was more than just low prices. Eddie and his family created a culture that celebrated deals and savings. His commercials weren't just selling electronics. They were selling an idea, a feeling that Crazy Eddie was on the customer side, bringing them deals they couldn't find anywhere else. And Eddie didn't stop at commercials. He threw extravagant events, creating a public persona that fascinated customers and investors alike. Everyone was talking about Crazy Eddie, and his brand seemed unstoppable. But while Crazy Eddie looked like a dream on the outside, it was built on lies and deception. In 1984, Eddie Antar made a bold move. He took Crazy Eddie public on the NASDAQ, opening his company up to investors. It was an incredible step, and it sent a message to Wall Street. Crazy Eddie was a serious player in the electronics market. Going public meant millions in capital for expansion, and Eddie wasn't about to pass up the opportunity. With this new investment, he planned to grow Crazy Eddie into a national powerhouse. But to keep up appearances, he had to keep the numbers high. His business needed to look profitable, even when it wasn't. To make the company seem successful, Eddie began manipulating financial records on a larger scale. He inflated inventory, boosted fake sales, and created a facade of success. Wall Street was convinced, and Crazy Eddie's stock soared. But it was all an illusion, a bubble that would soon burst. With Crazy Eddie's stock performing well, Eddie had made it. Investors trusted him, the public adored him, and his stores were everywhere. Eddie was no longer just an entrepreneur. He was a legend in the retail world. But with great success came the need for even greater deception. To maintain high profits, Eddie had to keep inflating numbers and hiding losses. The more successful Crazy Eddie became, the more Eddie felt trapped in his own scheme. Behind the scenes, he and his family were constantly adjusting numbers, creating fake transactions, and laundering money. It was a game they couldn't afford to lose, and the stakes kept rising with every quarter. As the money rolled in, Eddie's lifestyle grew more extravagant. He bought luxury homes, expensive cars, and threw lavish parties, living like a king. For him, it was proof of his success, a testament to how far he'd come from his modest beginnings. Eddie's family shared in the wealth, indulging in the luxuries of their newfound fortune. But the more they flaunted their wealth, the harder it became to hide the truth. People began to wonder how Crazy Eddie could afford such extravagance. Eddie brushed it off, keeping up appearances and ensuring his brand stayed strong. But deep down, he knew he was playing with fire. The more he lied, the more pressure he felt. The deception was catching up to him, and he knew it couldn't go on forever. As Crazy Eddie's success grew, so did the scrutiny. Some investors and analysts began to notice strange patterns in the company's financials. Inventory numbers seemed inconsistent, and sales records didn't always add up. Whispers of fraud began circulating, but Eddie brushed them off, confident that no one could uncover the full extent of his deception. He had gone to great lengths to keep his secrets safe, and he was sure he could outsmart any auditors or investigators. But as more people started asking questions, the Antar family grew nervous. They had built an empire on lies, and it was becoming harder to keep those lies hidden. They knew they were running out of time. In the late 1980s, regulators and auditors began investigating Crazy Eddie's financials. Eddie tried to stay calm, but he knew that if they dug too deep, they'd find everything. He and his family had to cover their tracks, and they scrambled to hide evidence of the fraud. The Antar family had hidden millions in offshore accounts, and they started moving money around to avoid detection. But the investigators weren't going to be fooled easily. They noticed the inconsistencies, and they began to uncover. With investigators closing in, the Antar family became desperate. Eddie instructed his family members to shred documents, erase records, and do anything necessary to keep their scheme under wraps. But despite their efforts, the evidence was too widespread, too deeply embedded in the company's operations to completely erase. The audit report started to paint a damning picture. Investigators found inflated inventory, phantom sales, and suspiciously large cash withdrawals. They discovered how Crazy Eddie had been using fake transactions and exaggerated profits to create a mirage of success. As the fraud began to unravel, investors lost faith in the company. The stock price, once riding high, began to plummet. Eddie's empire was crumbling before his eyes, and he knew it was only a matter of time before he'd have to face the consequences. As news of the investigation spread, the public was stunned. Crazy Eddie had been a trusted name, a brand that promised fair prices and honest deals. Customers felt betrayed, and investors were furious as they watched their investments evaporate overnight. The media jumped on the story, turning it into a national scandal. Headlines accused Eddie of fraud, deception, and corporate theft. The public, once captivated by Crazy Eddie's energetic commercials, now saw him as a greedy villain who had tricked them all. People who had once idolized Eddie now wanted justice. The story of Crazy Eddie became a cautionary tale, a reminder that sometimes what seems too good to be true often is. With his empire in ruins and investigators closing in, Eddie made a daring decision. He fled the country. In a desperate attempt to avoid prison, he escaped to Israel, taking with him millions of dollars stashed in secret accounts. Eddie believed he could start fresh, using his hidden fortune to live a quiet life in hiding, but he underestimated the determination of U.S. authorities. The government wasn't about to let one of the biggest fraudsters of the decade disappear without consequences. While Eddie lived as a fugitive, U.S. authorities launched an international manhunt, tracking his movements and working with Israeli officials to locate him. Eddie's life as a free man was on borrowed time. In 1992, after years on the run, Eddie was finally captured in Israel. U.S. officials celebrated his arrest, and the media covered the story with relentless enthusiasm. Eddie Antar, the man once hailed as a retail genius, was brought back to the United States to face justice. Upon his return, he was placed in handcuffs and led into court, surrounded by cameras and reporters. The man who had built his empire on charisma and cleverness now faced the harsh reality of his actions. The extradition was a turning point, not just for Eddie, but for the entire Antar family, who had played roles in the deception. The case against Crazy Eddie was about to reveal the full extent of one of the most audacious frauds in American history. The trial of Eddie Antar began, and it quickly became one of the most talked about cases in the country. In the courtroom, prosecutors laid out their evidence, revealing how Eddie Eddie had masterminded a web of lies to deceive investors, customers, and the public. Witnesses testified against him, including former employees who detailed how Eddie manipulated inventory, fabricated sales, and funneled cash into hidden bank accounts. The prosecution's case was powerful, and it painted a damning picture of a man willing to do anything for wealth. Eddie's defense team tried to shift the blame, suggesting that others were responsible or that he didn't know the full extent of the fraud. But the evidence was overwhelming. The jury listened as the shocking details of the Crazy Eddie empire were laid bare. After weeks of testimony and evidence, the jury found Eddie Antar guilty on multiple counts of fraud and conspiracy. The judge didn't hold back in his sentencing, condemning Eddie's actions as a betrayal of trust and an insult to honest business owners everywhere. Eddie was sentenced to several years in prison, marking the end of an era. As he was led away in handcuffs, the public watched, knowing justice had finally been served. The Crazy Eddie story had come to a dramatic end. For Eddie, prison was a far cry from the luxury and power he had enjoyed. He spent his days reflecting on how his greed had destroyed everything he had built. The Crazy Eddie empire, once unstoppable, was now nothing more than a cautionary tale. The Crazy Eddie scandal sent shockwaves through Wall Street. Investors who had poured millions into the company suffered huge losses, and many were left questioning how such fraud could go undetected for so long. Financial analysts and regulators began scrutinizing companies more closely, wary of other potential frauds. The Crazy Eddie case sparked changes in how companies were audited, pushing for stricter regulations to prevent future scams. The scandal became a landmark case, setting a precedent for corporate accountability. The financial world had learned a harsh lesson, and Eddie's story was now a warning to companies across the country. The fallout from the Crazy Eddie scandal didn't end with Eddie. Many members of the Antar family faced lawsuits, fines, and legal battles as prosecutors sought to recover as much of the stolen money as possible. Some family members cooperated with authorities, sharing insider knowledge of how Eddie's schemes had operated. This cooperation helped investigators unravel the full scale of the fraud, but it also created tension and division within the family. The Antars, once a close-knit family, were now fractured. The empire Eddie had built had destroyed not only his life, but also the lives of those closest to him. Today, the name Crazy Eddie is synonymous with corporate fraud. The commercials that once entertained America are now remembered as symbols of deceit and greed. Eddie's story became a powerful reminder that even the brightest empires can fall if they're built on lies. The Crazy Eddie scandal is still studied in business schools, taught as a cautionary tale to future entrepreneurs. Eddie Antar's legacy, once rooted in ambition, is now marked by the high cost of deception. Eddie had achieved the fame he desired, but it came at a tremendous cost. The Crazy Eddie empire, once unstoppable, became a story that would live on for generations, not as a triumph, but as a tragic downfall. After serving his prison sentence, Eddie was released, a free man, but with a tarnished reputation. He spent his remaining years away from the spotlight, reflecting on the choices that had cost him everything. Though he tried to return to the world of business, Eddie's name was now synonymous with fraud. He struggled to find his place in a society that saw him as a symbol of greed and betrayal. Eddie lived the rest of his life in obscurity, far from the fame and fortune he had once enjoyed. His story became a permanent reminder of the consequences of unchecked ambition. The Crazy Eddie story taught valuable lessons to the world of business. It showed that greed, if left unchecked, could destroy even the most successful empires. It reminded people that deception might bring short-term gains, but the truth will eventually come to light. For investors, the scandal reinforced the importance of scrutiny and transparency. It reminded them to question, to investigate, and to never take numbers at face value. Eddie Antar's downfall became a lesson in accountability, a stark warning that integrity is the foundation of any lasting success. And so, the story of Crazy Eddie comes to an end. It's a story of ambition, greed, and the relentless pursuit of power, a tale that reminds us that no empire built on lies can stand forever. Please remember to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more gripping stories from the world of finance and crime. Stay tuned until next time. Remember, behind every fortune lies a story, and sometimes the darker the story, the greater the lesson.